Before we begin tonight's story, I'd like to ask you for a quick favor. If you enjoy unsettling true tales and eerie encounters like this one, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story when it drops. And while you're here, leave a comment down below with where you're listening from. Your city, your state, even your country. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. And trust me, you might not be the only one awake at this hour. Now, settle in, turn the lights down low, and let's begin. My name is Daniel Price. I'm 42 years old, and for almost a decade, I worked as a mortuary transport technician. If you've never heard of that job, you're not alone. Most people don't know it exists until they suddenly need someone like me. What it meant, in plain terms, is that I was the one who moved the dead, from where they passed to where they had to go next, whether that was a funeral home, the coroner's office, or, in some cases, a medical research facility. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of job you tell people about at parties. In fact, I usually didn't tell people at all, because when you say, I transport bodies for a living, people don't know whether to shake your hand or take a step back. But it was honest work, steady work, and somebody had to do it. Most nights, my job was routine, quiet even. But one night, at 1 a.m, inside a science donation center, I came face to face with someone who shouldn't have been there. A man who never spoke, never acknowledged me, and then vanished without a trace. I've transported thousands of the dead, but that night, I realized maybe the dead aren't the only ones who walk those halls. That memory is sharper than any other. And it's the reason I still check over my shoulder whenever I'm alone in a silent building. But before I tell you exactly what happened that night, you need to understand what the job really looked like, because it's the atmosphere, the places, the times, the silence that made that encounter what it was. Being a mortuary transport tech put me in the middle of things. I wasn't a doctor, I wasn't a nurse, I wasn't a coroner or a funeral director. I was the quiet connection between them. Someone dies, and suddenly there's a timeline. The living can pause, argue, grieve. The dead don't wait. They're expected here, required there. There are forms to sign, doors to unlock, stretchers to wheel, and that was my role, to keep the chain moving. People like to joke that death is the end of appointments. But in my world, the opposite was true. The dead had more appointments than anyone I knew alive. It was usually just me, my van, and the road. Long, empty drives at hours when the world feels hollow. Sometimes it was raining, sometimes snowing, sometimes just dead still. And always, behind me, strapped down in the back, was my passenger. No conversation, no complaints. Just the weight, a reminder of who I was carrying. You'd be surprised at how much you notice when you spend your nights this way. The way a city hums when everyone's asleep. The glow of a lone gas station at 3 a.m. The silence of neighborhoods where every house is dark, except for one flickering TV light in a window. You learn to read those silences like they're words. Every stop carried its own mood. Hospitals were busy even at night, but when you walked into the morgue, it was like crossing into a different world. Cold air that clung to your skin, white tile that echoed your footsteps back at you. So it always sounded like you were being followed. And paperwork, always paperwork, signed by someone who barely looked you in the eye. Nursing homes were different, softer, sadder, staff whispering, families crying in hushed voices as I wheeled their loved one away under a white sheet. There, the air felt heavy with grief, with people trying to be composed and failing. Accident sites, though, those were the ones that stayed with me. Flashing lights, smoke still hanging in the air, twisted metal cooling in the night. Crowds of people gathered on sidewalks, some watching openly, some looking away, but not able to hide their glances. You'd load a body with glass still scattered on the ground, with the smell of gasoline or burnt rubber in the air. And you could feel how violently that life had just ended. Each of these places had its own signature, its own way of reminding me that every body I moved had a story, and I was just there to close the final chapter. People used to ask if I was afraid of the dead. They imagined corpses sitting up, eyes opening, or whispers in the dark. But that was never the fear. The bodies themselves were still, silent, predictable. The real fear came from the in-betweens. The silences that stretched too long. The moments when you were alone in a corridor at 1 a.m, the hum of the lights overhead, and the thought creeps in that maybe you're not as alone as you should be. It wasn't the dead that unsettled me. It was the buildings, the morgue hallway where the lights flickered like they were trying to signal something. The quiet of a donation center, where cold storage hummed on one side and endless file cabinets lined the other. The feeling that time itself slowed down when you were moving a body through those spaces. I kept my head down. I learned to focus on routine. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. If I kept the rhythm, the job stayed manageable. But if I let myself think too long about the emptiness, about the silence, about the eyes I sometimes imagined on me, that's when it got harder. For the most part, that rhythm carried me through. I worked my nights, I did my job, and I went home with the stories tucked away. But there was one story I couldn't tuck away. It happened at a science donation center, the kind of place where people send their bodies to be used for research after death. The kind of place where, at 1 a.m, the only sounds should be the echo of your own footsteps and the hum of the freezer. That night, I learned something I've never forgotten. I wasn't the only one moving among the dead. A typical night on the job didn't begin with sirens or flashing lights. It usually started with a phone call. Sometimes it was a hospital clerk with a calm, practiced voice. Sometimes it was a nurse speaking too softly, like they were afraid the sound might disturb the silence of the room they were in. Other times, it was the county dispatcher, reading details off a screen like it was just another line item in the night's long list of emergencies. No matter who called, the message was always the same. Someone had passed, and it was time to move them on to the next stop. That was my cue. I'd grab my clipboard, check my supplies, and wheel out the gurney. Then it was just me, the van, and the long road ahead. The van wasn't anything special to look at. Plain white, no logos, no markings. But inside, it was built for one purpose. The rear was fitted with rollers and straps to secure the gurney, a storage shelf for supplies, and enough space for me to move around if I had to adjust something. To most people, it probably would have looked like an empty delivery vehicle. But for me, every time I opened those doors, it felt like stepping into the next chapter of somebody's story. Loading the gurney was a ritual. Wheel it in, lock the brakes, secure the straps, double-check everything twice. A mistake here wasn't just sloppy, it was disrespectful. No matter how many times I'd done it, I treated each one like it mattered. Because it did. Then came the part most people don't think about. The drive. Long stretches of road in the dead of night, with nothing but the hum of the van as company. The world looks different at those hours. The highways are emptier, the gas stations glow like islands in the dark, and the houses you pass feel sealed off, their windows dark, their lives paused. Rain was common in my part of the country, and on those nights, the wipers kept rhythm on the glass while drops tapped out a restless beat on the roof. You get used to solitude in this line of work. The silence behind you is constant, but it's not empty. Every turn you take, every bump you roll over, you know who's back there. You never forget it. And sometimes, even though you know it's impossible, you catch yourself glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see movement. You don't, but the thought stays with you. Over the years, I saw plenty of things that could have been stories in their own right. The time a family insisted on riding behind me, their car's headlights fixed on my van all the way to the funeral home. The time a hospital's elevator malfunctioned, leaving me stuck for half an hour with the body of a man who died that same morning in the very ward above. Or the time I swore I heard whispering from the back of the van, only to realize the radio had picked up static from a nearby tower. All of those moments stuck with me in different ways. But they were still explainable, or at least dismissible. You file them under odd or unsettling, and you move on, because that's what the job demands. But there's one night I never could file away. The night at the donation center. I'd been on shift since around 7 in the evening, and by the time midnight rolled around, I'd already made 2 runs. The third came in just after 12:30. A man, mid-60s, who had arranged for his body to be donated to science. His paperwork was clear, his family had already been notified, and my task was simple. Deliver him to the Brighton Institute for Anatomical Research. The Brighton Institute sat on the outskirts of town, just off a 2-lane road that cut through a stretch of woods. During the day, it looked like any other research facility. White walls, modern architecture, clean lines, and a parking lot full of cars. But at night, it was different. No lights in the windows, no sound but the wind through the trees, and the long shape of the building standing like a shadow against the sky. By the time I pulled out onto the highway, the rain had started again, tapping against the windshield in a steady rhythm. The van hummed along, tires hissing on the wet pavement, while the world outside blurred into streaks of dark and light. I remember thinking how empty the road felt, how even the usual late-night truckers seemed scarce. It was just me and my passenger, heading toward that silent building in the woods. I'd done this route before, dozens of times. I knew the turns, the landmarks, even the timing of the stoplights. But that night, something about it felt heavier. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was the stillness. Or maybe it was because, deep down, I already sensed this wouldn't be just another drop-off. When I finally turned onto the narrow road leading to the Brighton Institute, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The headlights caught the tall, rectangular outline of the building as it came into view. White during the day, it now looked gray and lifeless under the washed-out glow of the security lights. The parking lot was empty, as always at that hour. It was just after 1 a.m. when I pulled up to the garage door, pressed the button, and watched the metal roll upward into darkness. The sound echoed in the still night, and for the first time that shift, I felt my stomach tighten. I told myself it was routine, just another delivery. But as I drove the van inside and the door lowered behind me, sealing me in, I couldn't shake the feeling that this night was going to be different. The Brighton Institute for Anatomical Research was one of those buildings that looked clinical and harmless in daylight. Smooth white walls, square windows tinted to keep out the sun, landscaping that made it look more like a college campus than what it really was. A holding place for the dead. I'd been there plenty of times during the day, and the place felt almost busy then. Students walking the halls, researchers in lab coats carrying clipboards, the faint smell of coffee from the break room drifting into the main corridor. But at 1 in the morning, it was a different world entirely. The garage door rumbled open as I pressed the switch, a low metallic groan that echoed through the night. The van's headlights cut into the wide, empty bay on the other side, catching nothing but concrete floors and pale gray walls. The space was shaped like an L, the long side stretching toward the storage and processing rooms, the short side leading into offices and file cabinets. I'd always thought the design was strange, almost deliberate, like it was meant to hide something around the corner. I drove in and let the garage door close behind me. The metal panels slammed down, sealing me in, and the sound bounced off the walls like a gunshot before settling into silence. That silence was the first thing you noticed inside Brighton. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was heavy, almost physical, like a blanket pressing in on you. The air had its own character too, antiseptic, sharp, and sterile, but beneath it lingered something else. A chemical tang, faint but unmistakable, like the scent of disinfectant mixed with cold metal. I knew it well. It was the smell of preservation, of storage, of bodies waiting for study. I'd carried it on my clothes home more times than I could count, and I knew it never truly washed out. As I stepped out of the van, the sound of my boots on the concrete floor seemed unnaturally loud. Each step cracked through the silence and echoed back at me, as though someone else were walking just a few paces behind. The space was lit by fluorescent lights overhead, buzzing faintly. But even that sound felt swallowed up by the sheer stillness of the place. Brighton during the day could almost pass for ordinary. At night, though, it was different. The walls seemed closer, the shadows longer, the corners darker. The building didn't feel like it was asleep. It felt like it was watching, waiting. I went through the routine motions, checking the paperwork one last time, unclipping the restraints that held the gurney in place. The wheels squeaked as I rolled it backward out of the van, and the sound sliced through the silence like a blade. My hands tightened on the handles without me realizing. I'd been here countless times, but that night, something about the atmosphere put my nerves on edge. It wasn't fear of the dead. That part had never bothered me. It was the building itself. The way the garage seemed too large, too hollow, like sound disappeared into corners you couldn't see. The way the air felt cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms, even through my jacket. The way every step I took carried a second echo, as if someone else were moving just out of sight. I wheeled the gurney toward the far door that led deeper into the institute. I knew the path by memory. Through the wide corridor, past the filing cabinets, around the bend into the long room where the freezer stood like a vault. But that night, even before I reached the door, I felt uneasy. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow, and a single thought pressed into the back of my mind. I shouldn't be here alone. I paused at the door, hand on the push bar, gurney in front of me. The silence pressed harder. Behind me, the van sat with its headlights off, its shadow stretched across the concrete like a dark stain. Ahead, the corridor waited, lit but strangely hollow, stretching into the unknown. I told myself it was just another delivery, just another night. But as I pushed the door open and prepared to wheel the body inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in there. The corridor led straight into the cold room. Even before I touched the handle, I could feel the temperature shift, air seeping out through the cracks around the door, a faint chill that prickled across my skin. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the keys, and found the one I'd used 100 times before. The lock clicked open with a hollow sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness. The freezer door was heavy, built like a vault. I leaned into it with my shoulder, and it swung open on stiff hinges, releasing a wave of cold air that stung my cheeks and burned in my nostrils. It carried with it the unmistakable scent of chemicals and steel, sharp enough to make me blink. Inside, the room stretched long and narrow, lined with shelves from floor to ceiling. Each shelf was stacked with carefully wrapped remains, sealed in heavy white covering, and marked with thick strips of blue tape. The tape wasn't meant to disguise what was inside. It was more like a placeholder, a way to keep things organized. You could still make out the shapes beneath: a pair of legs, neatly bundled, a torso, rigid under the wrap, what looked like a hand, fingers curled slightly, even through the material. The sight never really got easier. I'd been in dozens of morgues, but there was something different about this room. It wasn't just one body laid out on a table, it was an inventory. A storage of human parts, stacked and labeled, like a library no one wanted to read. I wheeled the gurney into the center aisle, the wheels rattling faintly on the metal grates that lined the floor. My breath fogged in front of me, and each exhale seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. The silence was broken only by the low hum of the refrigeration system and the faint metallic creak of the shelving. Expanding and contracting in the cold. Routine took over. That was the only way to get through it. Clip the paperwork to the wall station. Log the time, the name, and the identification number. Double-check the chart against the tag on the wrist. Then, with practiced movements, I lifted the sheeted body from the gurney onto the rolling lift. The hydraulics groaned as I pumped the lever, raising the platform to match the height of the waiting shelf. The shelf itself looked ordinary enough, just another slot in a long row, but sliding the body onto it was a reminder of what the room really was. A place where individuality was stripped away. Where names were reduced to numbers and the once living became entries in a system. The lift hissed as I lowered it back down, the sound sharp in the cold stillness. I stepped back, rubbed my hands together for warmth, and glanced once more at the shelves. Dozens of wrapped forms, each sealed in the same way, each silent and anonymous. It felt less like a freezer and more like a congregation of the forgotten. I closed the clipboard, checked off the final line, and stepped back toward the door. The hinges moaned as I pulled it shut, the sound dragging through the silence like a warning. When the heavy seal latched closed, the freezer's hum dimmed behind it, leaving me once again in the quiet corridor. The gurney was empty now, just a bare frame of metal and wheels. I gripped the handles and began pushing it back toward the corner where the file cabinet stood. The wheels squeaked against the floor, the sound echoing ahead of me. And that's when the unease set in. The freezer was behind me, locked, secure. The job was done. But the silence that followed me as I wheeled the gurney out didn't feel like relief. It felt like something was waiting. I pushed the empty gurney toward the bend in the corridor, the wheels squeaking in protest as they rolled across the polished floor. My eyes were still adjusting from the stark brightness of the freezer to the softer, buzzing glow of the fluorescent lights in the hallway. I rounded the corner without thinking, half on autopilot, ready to wheel the gurney back to the garage and head home. And then I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the row of file cabinets that lined the wall, stood a man. For a split second, my brain tried to fit him into the picture the same way it would if I'd seen a nurse, or a security guard, or anyone else who had any reason to be there. But the longer I looked, the less sense it made. He wasn't wearing scrubs, or a lab coat, or even the plain uniform of security staff. No ID badge, no gloves, no clipboard. Instead, he looked like he'd just walked in off the street. Dark jeans, a fitted jacket zipped halfway up, shoes polished enough to catch the dim light overhead. Ordinary clothes? Too ordinary. My chest tightened like a fist had grabbed it from inside. The shock hit me so hard I had to grab the gurney's handle tighter to keep from stumbling. My heart raced up into my throat, and I swear for a second I thought I was about to keel over right there. Later, I joked to myself that I nearly had a heart attack. But in that moment, it wasn't a joke. My pulse was hammering, loud enough that I could hear it in my ears. He didn't turn, didn't even seem to notice me. He stood with one drawer pulled out in front of him, a thick file folder open in his hands, his head bent slightly, as though he was studying it. His posture was stiff, but not unnatural. He could have been anyone, standing in any office, reading any set of records. That was what made it worse. Because this wasn't any office. It was the Brighton Institute. It was 1 a.m, and I was supposed to be alone. The silence was so sharp that the small sounds became amplified. The faint hum of the overhead lights, the squeak of the gurney wheels as they shifted slightly under my grip, even the soft rasp of paper as he turned a page. My mouth went dry. I forced myself to swallow and find my voice. "Hey," I said, the word awkward and too loud in the stillness. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." No response, not a glance, not a shift of his shoulders. He didn't even twitch. I cleared my throat, tried again, softer this time, like maybe I'd scared him and he needed reassurance. "You almost gave me a heart attack standing there like that." Still nothing. He just kept staring at the open file in front of him. I shifted my stance, rolling the gurney forward a few inches. The wheels squealed against the floor, the sound echoing up and down the corridor. It was the kind of sound you'd expect anyone to notice. But the man didn't. His eyes never lifted from the folder. I studied him harder, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe he was staff, someone I just hadn't seen before. But the clothes didn't fit. Maybe he was a janitor, off-duty. No cart, no tools. Maybe he was homeless. Somehow slipped in to get out of the rain. But if that were the case, why stand there calmly flipping through files like he belonged? I opened my mouth again, my voice a little unsteady. "Do you, work here? You're here late?" Still nothing. The longer he ignored me, the stranger it felt. It wasn't just that he wasn't answering. It was the way he seemed locked into that one motion, like a machine programmed to turn pages. He didn't shuffle his feet, didn't scratch his nose, didn't acknowledge that someone else was standing not 10 feet away. I felt my skin prickle. Not because of what he was doing, but because of what he wasn't doing. Any living, breathing person reacts, even a little. They look up, they frown, they wave you off. This man didn't. It was as if I didn't exist. The fluorescent light above him flickered once, buzzing, then steadied. It cast a faint shadow under his jaw. And for a second, I could have sworn his lips curved, just barely, as if he'd heard me and was holding back a smile. But when I blinked, the expression was gone, replaced by the same blank concentration on the folder. I stood frozen, torn between turning around and leaving or pushing the gurney right past him like nothing was out of the ordinary. My instincts screamed that something was off. But routine told me to keep moving, finish the job, and get out. I let out a shaky laugh, trying to shake the tension. "Well, sorry if I bothered you, just finishing up here." My words fell into the air like stones into water. No ripple, no splash. Just swallowed by silence. And that silence was what got me the most. It wasn't the man himself, not yet. It was the fact that in a place where every sound should echo, where the squeak of wheels and the hum of lights followed me like ghosts, this man's presence made no sound at all. The gurney shifted under my hand, reminding me I was still gripping it hard enough to hurt my fingers. I pushed it forward a few more inches, its wheels shrieking like they hadn't been oiled in years. My heart leapt at the noise, expecting, hoping it might finally make him react. But he didn't. He didn't so much as blink. And in that moment, I knew. Whoever he was, whatever he was doing, he wasn't going to acknowledge me at all. For a long moment, I just stood there with the gurney in front of me, staring at the man by the file cabinets. My heartbeat hadn't settled since the first shock of seeing him, and the silence pressed heavier with every second he ignored me. I tried again. "Seriously, you almost gave me a heart attack," I said, forcing a half laugh. My voice bounced awkwardly off the walls, too loud, like it didn't belong in that corridor. Still nothing. He didn't so much as flinch. His head stayed bent toward the file, his hand holding the folder steady, the other resting lightly on the drawer. It wasn't just that he wasn't answering. It was that he wasn't reacting at all. Not to me, not to the squeal of the gurney, not to the echo of my own voice. I shifted my grip on the gurney's handle, fingers tightening, and tried again. "I'm sorry if I startled you earlier. Didn't mean to sneak up on you." Silence. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I thought maybe I wasn't speaking clearly enough. So I raised my voice, almost shouting this time, "Hey, I said I didn't mean to scare you." Nothing. Not even a blink. It was then that I realized how still he really was. Most people, even when they're focused, move a little, shift their weight from one foot to the other, scratch their face, run a hand through their hair. But this man didn't. He stood perfectly upright, eyes locked on the file in his hand, as though he'd been frozen in place. I stared at him, waiting to see his chest rise or fall, waiting for some sign that he was breathing. I thought I saw the faintest movement, but it was so slight I couldn't be sure. A chill slid down my spine, and the cold air in the hallway suddenly felt sharper, cutting through my jacket like a knife. I took a step closer, the soles of my boots clicking against the floor. The sound echoed down the corridor, but he didn't turn, didn't even twitch. "Look," I said, forcing my voice steady. "It's late. I'm just finishing up. I didn't mean to disturb you." Again, silence. I stared at him for another long beat, then tried humor, the way you might when a situation feels too strange to handle seriously. "You must be really into those files, huh? Don't worry, I won't tell anyone you're working overtime." No response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. That was when the first real wave of doubt crept in. Maybe he couldn't hear me. Maybe he was deaf. Or maybe he had headphones in, though I saw no wires, no earbuds, nothing. Or maybe he was just ignoring me on purpose, though why anyone would do that in the middle of the night, in a locked building, made no sense. The longer I stood there, the stranger it became. His stillness wasn't natural. It wasn't like someone deep in concentration or someone who didn't care I was there. It was like he was locked into place, programmed to do only one thing: stare at that file. I studied him more closely. His clothes were modern but plain: dark jeans, a jacket zipped halfway, shoes that looked clean and polished. But the longer I looked, the more I realized how wrong they seemed here. Everyone I'd ever seen at Brighton wore lab coats, scrubs, gloves, or at least a badge clipped to their belt. This man had none of that. He looked like he'd been plucked off the street and dropped into the middle of a research facility at 1 a.m. And that, more than anything, was what made my skin prickle. Because I knew the time. It was past 1 a.m. I'd locked the garage door behind me. No one else was supposed to be here. I told myself maybe he was a staff pulling an overnight shift. But then, why no idea? Why was there no reaction when another employee walked right in on him? I told myself maybe he was lost. But then, How had he gotten into a locked building at this hour? Every possibility unraveled as soon as I thought of it. I shifted again, pushing the gurney another few inches. The wheels shrieked across the tile, a sound so sharp it made me wince. Surely he'd react to that. But he didn't. His head never lifted. His hand never twitched. His eyes never left the file. The silence grew unbearable. My thoughts ran wild, every possible explanation tumbling over the other. What if he were homeless and had broken in? But if that were true, why would he be calmly studying paperwork? What if he was security, testing me, seeing if I'd react? But security didn't dress like that. What if he wasn't real at all? That thought lodged itself in my head, and I couldn't shake it. The longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was staring at something that wasn't supposed to exist. The fluorescent light above him flickered again, humming, then steadied. In the half-second of dimness, I thought I saw his face differently, paler, more hollow, his mouth pulled in a faint curve. When the light steadied, the expression was gone. I blinked hard, telling myself I imagined it. Finally, I exhaled, forcing myself to move. I couldn't just stand there all night waiting for him to acknowledge me. The job wasn't done yet. The gurney had to be returned, the paperwork finalized, the garage locked up. So, I made a choice. "All right," I said aloud, my voice too thin, too nervous. "I'll let you get back to whatever you're doing." I gripped the gurney tighter and started pushing it toward the garage. My footsteps and the squeal of the wheels filled the hall, but the unease clung to me like cold sweat. I didn't look back at him, not right away. But even with my eyes forward, I could feel it. That weight of silence behind me, heavy and deliberate. And deep down, I knew. Ignoring him wouldn't make the unease go away. I forced myself to focus on the checklist. Routine. That was always the answer when something didn't feel right. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. If I let myself drift too long into thinking about the man by the file cabinets, I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep going. First, the freezer. I walked back to the heavy door, the empty gurney rattling along in front of me. The steel handle was icy against my palm as I checked it twice, making sure the lock had clicked into place. I leaned in and tugged. Solid. The chill leaking through the seam stung against my cheek. Good enough. Then the paperwork. I pulled the clipboard from the wall station and flipped through the sheets. The name, the identification number, the drop-off time. All in order. My pen scratched across the last signature line, the sound far too loud in the silence. Normally, that little ritual was nothing. Ink on paper, initials on the dotted line. But with the man only a few yards away, still hovering in the corner of my vision, it felt like my hand was trembling as I wrote. I set the clipboard back on its hook and stepped away. That was the last of it. The job was technically done. All I had to do was roll the gurney back into the garage, load up, and leave. But every movement felt heavier than it should have. I could feel him behind me, not watching. No, that was the strangest part. He wasn't looking at me at all. He hadn't since the moment I'd seen him. His eyes were locked on that file, page after page, as though I didn't even exist. And yet, somehow, his presence filled every corner of the space. So much that I couldn't take a step without being aware of him. I risked a glance. He was still there, posture unchanged, head bent, the drawer open in front of him. Perfectly still. It might as well have been a photograph. I turned back quickly, pretending I was only focused on the gurney. My throat tightened as I gripped the handles and pushed. The wheels squealed across the floor, the sound ricocheting down the empty hallway. It was unbearable in the silence, and yet he didn't react. Not a shift of the shoulders, not a flicker of an eye. Nothing. I forced myself to keep moving, my body going through the motions of routine while my mind screamed at me to look again, to confirm he was real. But every task seemed magnified, like I was performing under a spotlight. The freezer was secure. The paperwork was logged. I even checked the outer door latch, pressing it down harder than usual, just to keep my hands busy. I told myself it was just nerves, just another late-night run, and I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But it didn't feel like imagination. The air seemed heavier with every second I lingered. Even the lights buzzed louder, the fluorescent hum vibrating in my skull. The smell of disinfectant that had been faint when I first arrived now seemed sharper, almost chemical, burning in the back of my throat. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath. And through it all, the man stayed perfectly still. I had the irrational urge to shout, to demand he acknowledge me, to say, "I know you're there. I see you." But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of breaking the fragile balance of silence. Maybe it was the creeping suspicion that if I forced him to look at me, I might not like what I saw in his eyes. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I talked to fill the void. "I'm just about wrapped up here," I said, my voice shaky. "Heading out in a minute." No response. I fiddled with the gurney, adjusting the straps, though there was nothing on it anymore. Metal buckles clinked as I pulled them tight, the sound harsh against the silence. "You must be on a late shift," I added, trying for casual. Didn't realize anyone else was working tonight. Again, nothing. Not a sound. The silence pressed in harder. My skin prickled. I was sweating now, even though the air still felt cold enough to sting. I ran a hand over my forehead, my palm coming away damp. I knew I couldn't stand there forever. I had to finish. Had to get out. So I did something almost childish, like I was testing the universe itself. I said it out loud, forcing the words into the air. "I'm going to the bathroom. I'll be right back." The words hung there, echoing once before fading into silence. The man didn't move, didn't even lift his head. That was worse than anything else. Because if he'd turned, if he'd spoken, if he'd even grunted in acknowledgement, I could have explained it away. But the absolute lack of reaction, the way he stayed rooted to that spot like a statue, it was as if the building itself had conjured him, just to stand there and ignore me. I pushed the gurney another few feet, the squeal of the wheels scraping my nerves raw. Then I turned toward the bathroom down the short hall, my legs heavy, every step slower than it should have been. Behind me, the silence deepened. And though I didn't look back, I knew he was still there. The bathroom at Brighton was nothing special. A single stall setup tucked off the short hallway near the garage, just a plain white door with a tarnished handle and a little sign that read "Restroom" in block letters. I'd used it dozens of times before. Never thought much of it. But that night, when I pushed the door open, it felt like stepping into another trap. The fluorescent light flickered overhead as I flipped the switch, buzzing alive in a sputter before settling into a steady glare. The room smelled faintly of bleach and industrial soap, that sharp, sterile scent that clung to every corner of the building. Normally, it was a relief. But tonight, even that smell felt oppressive, like it was trying to mask something underneath. I closed the door behind me and twisted the lock, the click echoing much louder than it should have. I stood there for a moment, palms pressed against the edge of the sink, breathing harder than I realized. My reflection in the mirror looked pale, almost sickly under the harsh light. Dark circles under my eyes, lips pressed thin, sweat beading along my hairline. I looked like a man in trouble, even though all I had done was see another human being standing by some files. Only it didn't feel like that. It didn't feel like I'd seen someone. It felt like I'd seen something. I turned on the faucet and let the cold water run over my hands. The sound of it gurgling down the drain filled the silence, but it didn't calm me. If anything, it made me realize just how silent everything else was. Normally, even in this tucked-away corner of the building, you could hear faint traces of life. The hum of the refrigeration system, the distant creak of pipes, the faint rustle of air moving through vents. But tonight, there was nothing. Just the splash of water and the thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. I leaned closer to the mirror. "Get it together," I muttered under my breath. My voice sounded foreign, shaky, like it belonged to someone else. Who was that man? Why didn't he answer? I ran through every explanation again. Staff member, no badge, no lab coat, security guard, wrong clothes, intruder. But how did he get inside a building locked from the outside? And the way he moved, or didn't move, was the worst of it. That absolute stillness. The way he seemed frozen in one posture, eyes glued to the folder as if he couldn't look away. No twitch, no blink, no breath I could see, just page after page turning like clockwork. I shut off the faucet and dried my hands, the paper towel crinkling loudly in the cramped room. My heartbeat seemed even louder now, thumping in my chest like a warning drum. I dreaded opening the door again. The thought of walking back into that corridor, of seeing him standing there exactly the same way, unchanged, still ignoring me, made my stomach knot. And yet, the thought of him not being there at all was somehow worse. Because if he was gone, then where had he gone? I leaned back against the wall, staring at the closed door as if it might swing open on its own. I counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3. Each one shallow, uneven. It was ridiculous. I was a grown man, 42 years old, with nearly a decade of experience moving bodies through morgues, hospitals, and accident scenes. I'd dealt with grieving families, with violent accidents, with death in every form. But I had never once been afraid to leave a bathroom before. And yet, here I was, standing frozen, because I didn't want to know what waited for me outside. Minutes dragged by. I don't know how many. The buzzing of the light overhead seemed to grow louder, filling my skull until it was almost unbearable. I splashed water on my face again, but it didn't help. My skin burned cold where the drops slid down. Finally, I couldn't stall any longer. I had to finish the job, had to leave the building, had to get out of here. I drew a deep breath, hand hovering on the lock. My pulse was a steady roar now. So loud I half expected the man outside to hear it, to turn toward me as soon as I stepped out. I twisted the lock. The click sounded final. Like the snap of a trap closing. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing down the hallway. My eyes adjusted quickly to the sterile light of the corridor, my gaze immediately sliding to the corner where the file cabinet stood. Empty. The drawer was still open, a folder left sitting half out. But the man was gone. Gone, without a sound, without footsteps, without passing me in the narrow hallway. And I hadn't heard a single thing. For a second, I just stood in the doorway, frozen, waiting for him to step back into view. But nothing happened. I forced myself forward, each step measured, heavy. My eyes locked on the open file drawer. It was still extended, pulled out waist-high. And there, balanced awkwardly on the edge, was the folder he'd been holding. A few sheets of paper spilled over, slightly skewed, like they'd been abandoned mid-turn. The sight made my skin prickle. He had been right there. I'd watched his hand hold that file steady. I'd watched him turn page after page with mechanical precision. Now the folder sat half open, waiting for hands that were no longer there. I crouched slightly, peering at the floor around the cabinet. No scuff marks, no footprints. The polished tile was spotless, as if no one had ever been standing there at all. I turned, scanning the hallway. Empty, silent. The bathroom hall I'd just come from was narrow, with only one door, mine. If he'd walked that way, I would have seen him. I would have heard him. The opposite direction led deeper into the building, toward the offices, the freezer, the processing rooms. But that hallway stretched long and bare, lined with glass windows and blank walls. You couldn't walk it without the sound carrying. And I hadn't heard a thing. The only other way out was the garage door. And that was impossible. I'd closed it myself when I brought the van in. The steel panels had slammed shut, the locks engaged from the inside. The control switch was mounted right by the door. If anyone had opened it, I would have heard the motor grind, felt the vibration under my boots. There was no way he could have slipped out that way. Yet he was gone. I spun back to the file drawer, staring at the folder as though it might explain itself. The papers looked ordinary enough. Forms, typed pages, maybe intake records. Nothing unusual. But the fact that they were there, skewed and waiting, made my chest tighten. He hadn't finished with them. He hadn't closed the drawer. It was like he'd vanished mid-motion. Paranoia crept in fast, wrapping itself tight around my thoughts. Maybe he wasn't supposed to be here. Maybe he'd broken in, rifled through files, and bolted the moment I turned my back. But then, how had he gotten in at all? Every door was locked, every window sealed. The garage sealed me in like a vault. Or maybe he was staff, someone with a key, someone I just didn't know. But if that were true, why not answer me? Why stand in silence, staring at papers, as though I were invisible? Or maybe... I cut the thought short before it could finish, but it clawed back anyway. Maybe he wasn't anyone at all. The silence seemed thicker now, heavier. My ears strained, desperate for sound. But there was nothing. Not footsteps, not doors closing, not even the ordinary hum of air vents I knew should have been there. Just emptiness. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at that open drawer, feeling my heartbeat thump harder in my chest. I could swear the air was colder now, though the thermostat on the wall glowed with the same numbers as always. I forced myself to move. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed the drawer shut. The metal rails screeched faintly as they slid home. The sound made me wince, like I'd broken some unspoken rule. The folder remained in my hand for a moment. I didn't even mean to pick it up. But when I looked down, there it was, my fingers gripping the manila edges. My first instinct was to flip it open, to see what he'd been staring at so intently. But the longer I held it, the more wrong it felt. Like it wasn't meant for me. Like touching it at all was crossing a line. I shoved it back into the drawer and pressed the cabinet shut until the latch clicked. The silence swallowed everything again. I turned toward the garage, gripping the gurney harder than necessary. My palms were slick with sweat. Every sound I made, each step, each squeak of the wheels, felt too loud, too conspicuous. I had the horrible sensation that someone somewhere, was listening. The thought of the man standing behind me again, silent, motionless, was unbearable. My neck burned with the need to glance over my shoulder, but I forced myself not to. I didn't want to know. When I reached the garage, I stopped and drew a shaky breath. My voice came out thinner than I intended, but it was all I could manage. "I'll be locking up now," I announced into the empty air. The words echoed once, bounced off the steel door, then dissolved into silence. No answer. Just like before. I hooked the gurney back into the van with hands that felt clumsy and too cold for the job. The metal latch didn't sit right under my fingers, like my mind wasn't moving in time with my body. I strapped everything down, checked the tie-downs twice because doing the checklist was a way to keep my brain occupied, to give it something mechanical to focus on instead of the man and the open drawer and the way the building had folded in on itself like a held breath. The garage still felt too large for one person. The ceiling lights threw long, sterile shadows that reached across empty concrete and swallowed the edges of the van. I shut the rear doors slowly and watched the space go dark, the light shrinking until only the tiny sliver under the personnel door remained. The metal panels rumbled as the big roll-up door began to lower. There's a thud to it, a finality that always made me feel boxed in. Tonight, the sound was a punch in the chest. I stepped out and hit the control for the alarm, fingers fumbling a bit on the keypad. The panel beeped once, then a steady light flashed, armed. I double-checked the doors and the freezer, one more walk-through because the rational part of me demanded proof. Locking the place down felt like sealing a lid on a pot that had been simmering too long. But even with the locks engaged and the alarm set, the air felt charged, like static right before a storm. I walked back toward the file cabinets to do a last visual sweep. My shoes made small, clipped noises against the floor. Every sound felt like its own thing, isolated, magnified. I told myself that I was being ridiculous, that fatigue plays tricks on your head and a late-night shift does strange things to your equilibrium. I'd worked some nights where the adrenaline was high and sleep low. I knew the fog that followed. But whatever mental excuses I lined up couldn't make the hollow, oppressive feeling slide away. Standing there, clipboard tucked under my arm, I took that last inventory in slow motion. Freezer, locked. Files, drawer pushed closed, though my fingers remembered the slight resistance it had when I closed it a few minutes ago. Garage door, lower. Van, loaded. Alarm, set. Paperwork, clipped. Keys in my pocket. Everything in order, everything as it should be, except the man. Except for the empty space where he had been and the folder left mid-turn. I took a breath and told myself I was done. I should have been relieved, satisfied that the job was complete. Instead, there was a pressure behind my eyes, an ache in the base of my skull that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. It was the sort of pressure that comes from too many unanswerable questions stacked up in a small space. I pivoted toward the exit, heading for the small personnel door that led out to the parking lot. The door had a narrow window, the kind they put in warehouse doors so you could see oncoming traffic. I found myself glancing at that window more than once during my walk, oddly hoping to see the familiar blur of my van parked in the lot. Instead, the glass reflected me back. A pale face, dark circles under tired eyes, a man who looked older than he felt. I stopped before I left and did something I'd done 1,000 times. One last look over my shoulder. Habit more than curiosity. Habit that night felt like a test I didn't want to fail. The corridor stretched back, fluorescent lights receding into shadow. The file cabinets stood where they always did, metal faces unremarkable and dull in the dim light. For a second, I thought I saw nothing but the rows of drawers. The one I'd closed a few minutes earlier, a quiet seam in the line. Then, in the corner of my eye, the glass caught something, movement, quick and small, like a fluttering of paper. I turned my head faster than I meant to, heart stabbing up into my throat. There, reflected faintly in the personnel door window, was the shape of a person, or at least something like a person, shifting near the file cabinet. Not a clear image, just a smear of motion, the suggestion of a shoulder moving, a hand perhaps pushing back a drawer. For an instant, the reflex to call out leapt up. "Hey," I wanted to say. "Hey, are you okay? Who are you?" But the words wouldn't form. My throat closed around them. Instead, I froze like a kid caught doing something he shouldn't. The image in the glass wavered, and then, as if a curtain had been drawn, it was gone. The window reflected only empty light again. My own face, the shadow of the van in the lot. I blinked, thinking maybe the motion had been a trick of the fluorescent flicker, or the way the glass had caught and distorted the overhead lights. I told myself it was nothing. A reflection of my own movement. A draft moving a loose sheet. A part of me that wanted things to be explained, to tie everything in neat little bows so I could drive home and sleep like a normal man. I should have left right then. I should have slammed the door behind me and got the van out into the rain and driven until the road washed the night away. But something rooted me to that spot. Not curiosity exactly. More like a stubborn refusal to let the thought of something dissolve into nothing without seeing it with my own eyes. It was a terrible compromise between logic and dread. I took one more step forward to be sure, just a step, then I would leave. The floor yielded beneath my weight with the same dull thud. The fluorescent light hummed, and the cold bit at my exposed skin. My eyes moved toward the file cabinet reflexively, and I watched each metallic face of the drawer, waiting for a sign. Nothing moved. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it all. Maybe the reflection had been my own sleeve, or a subtle change in the fluorescent glow. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the body of the man I just handled had left a residue that made me see things. Then the window reflected a flicker again. Subtle, like a page being turned. Only this time, it felt purposeful. The suggestion of a hand, the tilt of a shoulder. Not an accidental blur. Something deliberate. Whatever it was, it didn't belong in the stillness of Brighton at 1 a.m. My skin prickled. Every rational explanation filed itself away under a stack marked unlikely. The room felt colder, as if someone had opened another door somewhere, letting a draft sweep through. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. I didn't let myself hear the pounding of my heart the way it wanted to be heard. Instead, I breathed slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the same way you do when you're trying to steady something wild inside you. I forced my shoulders down, unclenched my fists, and walked the last few steps to the personnel door. My hand touched the handle. Cold metal, firm, real. I could have left. I could have locked the door and driven home, hands white-knuckled on the wheel, eyes scanning every shadow along the way. I could have told myself later that something odd had happened at Brighton and chalked it up to nerves. But there was that flicker in the glass. And until I knew for sure what it was, I couldn't shake the notion that leaving it unexplored would be a mistake. I leaned in for one more look, more curiosity than courage, and peered through the small rectangular window. The reflection was empty. My own face looked back, pale and tired, No blur, no shifted drawer, no suggestion of a figure. The corridor beyond was quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. And yet, from the corner of my eye, a shadow moved. A motion I couldn't quite place, somewhere further down the hall, where the file cabinets met the bend. It was the faintest thing, almost imperceptible, and maybe I wanted it to be nothing. But it was there. I told myself one last time, don't be stupid. Lock the door. Go home. Then, with a final breath that tasted like metal and old coffee, I pressed the personnel door open and stepped out into the parking lot, pulling the door closed behind me. The air hit me like a wall of cold. Rain had returned, misting the lot in a soft sheet. And the van's windshield was beaded with droplets. The lights over the sign hummed and rattled, and for an instant, the world felt normal in that ordinary, terrible way. I slid into the driver's seat, set the air to scrub the chill from my bones, and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. My hands were steady now, in a mechanical way, but my mind kept snapping back to the glass. Was there someone? Something, still inside? Between the drawers? Between the pages? I started the van and pulled out of the garage slowly, headlights cutting through the mist. As I rolled down the drive, my eyes kept flicking to the small personnel window in the door, searching for movement, for the smear of a figure, for the impossible. And in the glass, for a heartbeat, I thought I saw it again. A suggestion of motion just past the file cabinets, like a page turning itself in an empty room. Then it vanished. I gripped the steering wheel and forced the van into gear, the engine whining as I moved onto the roadway, and the Brighton Institute receded in the rearview mirror. An anonymous square block of shadow under rain-slick lights. Behind me, the building's outline blurred, and somewhere in the dark, the file drawer sat closed or open, depending on which memory your mind chose to trust. I drove away with the night pressing in, and the uneasy feeling of being watched like a warmth against the back of my neck. The van hummed along with a steady, indifferent sound. It would have been easy to blame the rhythm of the road or the tired fog in my head. But every now and then, when the road turned and the rain lifted and the world felt empty and safe, my eyes would flick to the rear view, and I'd swear for a second that the staff lights at Brighton seemed to blink in acknowledgement, like a building taking a breath, and that somewhere inside, a drawer had shifted imperceptibly, as if someone or something had turned a page and then closed the folder again. I never learned who that man was. Not the night it happened, not in the days after, not in all the years since. There was no note in the logbooks, no missing badge, no security report. No one from Brighton ever mentioned working that shift. And me? Well, I wasn't about to stick around and ask questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. That night should have faded into the blur of 1,000 others. I'd worked hundreds of runs, all with their own little oddities. Grieving families, faulty elevators, long lonely drives. Most of them I can't recall in detail now. But that one night, the one with the man at the file cabinet, burned itself into me like a brand. I can tell you the angle of the fluorescent light over his shoulder. I can tell you the exact squeak of the gurney wheel echoing down the hall. I can even tell you the pattern of the blue tape wrapped around the bodies in the freezer. That's how sharp it remains. Why this one? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. Maybe it was because nothing about it fit. There's a rhythm to this line of work, a grim clockwork where each part has its place. A body gets picked up, paperwork gets signed, the chain moves on. but that night shattered the rhythm. The presence of someone who shouldn't have been there turned the routine into a mystery I still can't solve. Over the years, I've tried to reason it out. The rational theories come first because they're easier to swallow. Maybe he was staff, working a late shift I just didn't know about. But if so, why no badge, no coat, no acknowledgement? Maybe he was an intruder, someone who'd slipped in with a stolen key. But then, how did he vanish without footsteps, without the sound of doors, without triggering the alarm? Maybe I was just exhausted, my mind weaving shadows into shapes that weren't there. But I've been exhausted many nights, and no other hallucination ever left a file drawer hanging open. And then there are the other explanations, the ones I don't like to say out loud. What if he wasn't alive at all? What if he was one of the very dead I'd been hauling through those corridors, returned not as a body, but as something else? A lingering soul, flipping through records of the life he'd lost. A spirit, trapped in the place that had reduced him to paperwork and blue tape. Or worse, a custodian of sorts, not human, not dead, but something that kept watch over the files, guarding secrets no living person was meant to see. That possibility haunts me more than any other. Because I can dismiss exhaustion, I can accept an intruder. But when I remember how still he was, unnaturally, impossibly still, I can't shake the feeling that I saw something outside the ordinary. I tell myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the mind. A late-night illusion in a sterile building that already felt haunted by the weight of its work. But no matter how many times I repeat it, no matter how many nights I spend in silence trying to push it away, the memory doesn't loosen its grip. After Brighton, routine stopped being comfort and became armor. Before that night, habit was just how I kept the job clean. Forms signed, straps checked, freezer locked, keys returned, drive home. After that night, habit turned into ritual, and ritual turned into defense. I doubled every check, then I tripled them. I started narrating my steps under my breath like a man counting beads. Freezer locked, paperwork filed, alarm armed, lights off, keys in pocket. If anyone had been around to hear me, they might have thought I was superstitious. Maybe I was. It wasn't that I believed the words could keep me safe. It was that silence had betrayed me once, and I wasn't going to give it another chance. The first change was the doors. All doors. At work, I pressed the freezer handle a second too long, waiting for the catch to settle in the frame. I tested the garage chain by hand, even when the indicator light glowed green. I pulled every office door behind me until I felt the frame tremble. At home, I added another deadbolt. Not because I thought any ordinary person was coming for me, but because something in me needed proof, physical, metal, unarguable proof, that boundaries still meant what I'd always believed they meant. That night at Brighton had taught me how thin a boundary could feel. Paper thin. The difference between looking at something and being looked at by it. The second change was paths. Places you walk 100 times make grooves in your body, grooves you fall into without thinking. I started avoiding the grooves that took me past file rooms. If there was a route around, I took it, even if it meant adding an extra minute to the walk. I learned the feel of each hallway's temperature and the particular note of its fluorescent buzz, the way you learn the stride of a friend from a distance. I timed the motion sensors on the lights and walked so they wouldn't flicker on too late and leave me in the dark even for a second. People don't think about how much of their day is choreographed by small, invisible decisions. What corridor, which elevator, which staircase. After Brighton, every decision cost me something. I made them anyway. I also changed how I looked at paper. That sounds ridiculous, I know. But the file cabinet became a symbol I couldn't step around. I used to see paperwork as a nuisance, a necessary friction in a world that runs on check marks. Now I saw it as a kind of mirror, a life pared down to lines and fields. Name, date, cause, destination, sign here. In those weeks, I couldn't handle the way a folder felt in my hands, too light for what it pretended to hold. I started keeping all the forms clipped tight, never leaving a page loose, never letting a corner hang over the edge of a tray. I didn't want to see another sheet poised like the one at Brighton, half-turned, mid-story. The mind does superstitious math when it's tired and afraid. Mine decided that a page left hanging invited attention I didn't want. People noticed in small ways. A nurse I'd known for years asked if I was sleeping okay. A funeral director joked that I was going to put him out of business by being more meticulous than he was. I laughed in the right places, told the right half-truths, long nights, tough cases. You know how it is. The truth was both simpler and harder. Something had stepped into my pattern and refused to leave. I tried to pin the feeling to something ordinary. I read about vigilance after the unusual. Those clinical words psychologists use for the way soldiers keep scanning open windows long after they're home, or how drivers flinch at intersections where they've seen a wreck. I told myself I was just managing residue. But the Brighton residue didn't behave like residue. It didn't fade according to any schedule. It spread, like a stain you can still see no matter how you turn the fabric toward the light. For a while, I avoided the Brighton Institute altogether. We had other routes, other facilities. If a call sheet came through with that address, I maneuvered politely to trade assignments. Nobody pushed back. In our line of work, you don't ask for explanations when a coworker wants to swap nights. You say, "I've got it," and you mean it. Even so, I knew the avoidance had a half-life. One night, inevitably, Brighton would land on my clipboard again. The anticipation turned into a second job. I was always waiting for the moment the name would appear. When it did, weeks later, I almost felt relief. There's a point where dread is worse than the thing itself. I parked in the same lot, walked through the same personnel door, felt the same chemical cold bite in the back of my throat. Routine saved me again, kept my hands moving when my mind didn't want to. I kept telling myself, freezer locked, paperwork filed, lights off, keys in pocket. I never saw the man again. The file drawers sat quietly, the corridors blank. But if you'd asked me to bet money, serious money, on whether the building felt different from any other night, I couldn't have done it. The color of the light was the same. The tone of the hum was the same. Still, I kept my eyes from the reflection in the personnel window as I left, because some proofs you don't need. You might assume I left the job soon after. I didn't. I kept working, for months and then years, with the same steady muscle memory I'd cultivated before. What changed wasn't my ability to work. It was the meaning I attached to the work. Before Brighton, I told myself a story, that I was a link in a chain, that dignity lives in small, careful motions done well. After Brighton, I told myself the same story and believed it more, not less. But I added a corollary, that what we do with the living matters because we can't always account for everything the dead might want. That sounds like superstition again. Maybe it is. Or maybe it's just humility by another name. The humility of realizing how much of the world runs on what we don't see. I tried talking about the night once, not in detail, not the way I'm telling you now. Just a sketch of it, over coffee with someone who understood the geometry of morgues and the way time folds inside hospitals after midnight. He listened with the patience of someone who has heard enough stories to know when to stop asking questions. When I was finished, he said, "The file room, huh?" Like I'd told him the weather. "You know some places keep the oldest paperwork close to the floor?" I asked why. He shrugged. "Weight of the years," he said, and smiled like it was a joke that wasn't a joke. We didn't talk about it again. I thought about quitting many times, not because I couldn't stand the work, but because I wondered whether stepping away would clear the space in my head where Brighton had built itself a small apartment. I imagined what a different job might feel like. Ordinary office light, daytime schedules, lunch at noon instead of midnight coffee that goes cold while you're pulling a zipper closed. But every time I tried on that thought, it fit oddly. The truth is, some people are built for edges, for thresholds. We do better where things begin and end, even if we can't say why. I stayed. Maybe I owed it to the lives I moved. Maybe I owed it to the part of me that still wanted to be necessary in the hour when most people sleep. I went back to Brighton in daylight once, on purpose. I asked for a daytime drop when the schedule could have gone either way, and I took it. Curious to see if the hallway that had become a geometry problem in my mind would flatten out in the sun. The building looked like it always did. White, clean, studious, an academic calm draped over every surface. The file cabinets were there, innocuous, filled with regular paper doing its regular job. People moved in and out of offices, carrying forms and coffee, making the daily, unmagical micro-decisions that keep institutions running. I felt foolish for a moment, standing there with my clipboard, half expecting to catch some shimmer in the corner of my eye. Nothing shimmered. Nothing moved. Light landings can make any room honest. I left, thinking perhaps I'd punctured the bubble. But that night, the dream returned exactly the way it always does. With the drawer not wholly open and not wholly shut, a single sheet suspended at the lip. I learned something about symbols as the years stacked up. You don't choose them, and you don't get to retire them. The file cabinet isn't magic. It isn't a portal. It's a common object I used to pass without a thought. But after Brighton, it became the way my mind talks to itself about endings. A life documented, an identity bounded by the width of a folder. Lives cataloged, yes, but also lives that might not be done speaking. You don't need a ghost for that to be true. You just need a room that removes the polite layer from things and leaves you with whatever they are underneath. So when people ask me, very gently, at the edges of other conversations, whether anything in my work ever felt like more than a coincidence, I don't tell them about voices or footsteps, about lids clattering or cold hands. That's movie talk. I tell them about a man who stood too still at the wrong hour, in the wrong place, not doing anything that should have mattered, and how that was the most unsettling thing of all. I tell them about the sound a drawer makes in an empty room, about the way a building seems to wait sometimes, the way light seems to hold its breath. And then I say something ordinary to tidy up the edges. Long hours, hard job, you know how it is. Because we all need a little tidiness to go back to sleep. Do I believe in ghosts? I believe in impressions. I believe in the stubbornness of certain moments to end just because we've reached the last line on a form. I believe in rooms that remember you, and in the opposite. You remembering a room because you left a part of yourself there. I believe that how quiet can teach you things noisy days never will. And I believe that a person can do a job like mine for a long time and still be surprised by what the night decides to show them. I've told you more than I've told most people. Maybe saying it out loud is its own ritual, another way to keep the edges where they belong. Maybe it's just a confession that even the most practical work, weights, signatures, roots, lives beside mystery, not across from it. Beside it. A neighbor you nod to, even if you don't exchange more than a glance. Years have passed. I'm not 42 anymore. The van has been replaced twice. The routes have shifted. Some of the nurses retired. A few young techs now wheel their own gurneys with that careful mix of respect and speed I recognized from my first year. Brighton still takes deliveries. I still go there sometimes. The building hasn't changed. That's one of the facts I anchor to when my mind wants to drift. Walls are walls, doors are doors, cabinets are cabinets. Facts are good ballast. And yet, when the shift runs late and I pull into my driveway, I still do a small circuit of the house before I sleep. Not a full patrol, just enough to feel the doors and the windows, to press my palm to the cool glass of the back door, to hear the soft tick of the thermostat. It's a way of telling my body what my mind sometimes forgets, that tonight is ordinary, that the world holds, that the things built to keep out the outside still do their job. Most nights, that's enough. On the others, I sit on the edge of the bed for a minute longer and let the house settle. I listen to the compressor kick off. I listen to the water heater exhale. I listen until the quiet smooths and the memory of the corridor dims. I think about the people I carried. I say a name or two out loud if I can remember one. Not all of them stick, but enough do. It helps. Names have weight. Files do not. Even after so much time and so many ordinary nights, there's a sliver of something I can't shake. A slice of Brighton that keeps itself alive in the folds of the mind where we store unfinished business. It doesn't demand much. It doesn't interrupt meals or work. It waits, patient as paper. Even now, years later, I still dream of the Brighton Institute. Not the van, not the freezer, not the paperwork. Just the file cabinet. In those dreams, the drawer is always open. A folder lies on the edge, waiting. I never see who's standing there, never see if it's the same man. But I feel it. The same cold silence, the same prickle on my skin. The same sense that something is turning a page just out of sight. And every time, I wake up before I can look inside.